Good afternoon, students. Hope everyone is doing well and welcome back after a short time away from your studies. Today we are looking at the foundations of international law. And the last class we discussed several aspects of international law. What is international law, how it is put together in terms of the process, as well as the impact of international law on the community of nations. We looked at all of those aspects and we are continuing our discussion today on the foundations of international law to have a good sense of how international law is intended and how it impacts nations across the globe and how nations respond to international law. Because these are sovereign nations. We're talking about nations that have independence, that are self-governing, that take care of their own affairs. They have to be subject to a superior law, so to speak, that governs the community of nations. So how do they respond to that? And what are the key aspects of international law? That's what we're looking at today. All right, so let's begin by taking a look at what international law is. And it says here international law, which is also referred to as public international law. So sometimes you see public international law, or sometimes you see international law. Now, don't be confused. They are the same thing. They are the same concept, the same principles, and the same set of laws we are talking about here. So international law, which is also referred to as public international law, the law of nations, right? So we have three terminologies going on here. So the law of nations, public international law or international law, consists of body of laws. Now, what does that mean? Let's stop here for a minute and begin to understand what this means, body of laws. So let me ask a question. What is body of law? That's a very good response, body of law, right? So it means a group of laws. It means a bunch of laws, right, that transcend international borders, right? So transcend here means surpasses, means goes beyond. Means that it doesn't have a limit in terms of the geographical space we're talking about here. It doesn't stop within the borders of one particular country. It transcends international borders and holds countries accountable. That's what international law does, right? It transcends international borders and holds countries accountable, and countries have to abide by international law if they are signatories to that law or to those laws. They have to abide by those laws. And the United Nations, for example, puts together international laws and puts together treaties. Geneva Convention is a good example of how countries have to abide by it. And we have many types of laws that we're going to be discussing as we move forward. So international laws are a body of laws that transcend international borders and holds countries accountable. Right? Now, what does it mean holding countries accountable? Let me ask a question. Anyone can answer this. When we say we're holding countries accountable, now don't forget, as we stated earlier, these are countries that are sovereign. These are countries that govern themselves. They determine their own affairs. They have their own laws. They enact their own laws. They enforce their own laws. How do we hold them accountable? Let me ask a question. Anyone? That's a very good point. We hold them accountable by asking them to abide by the laws, and if they don't abide by the laws, there are actions that can be taken. And depending on the situation, depending on the violation of the law, it could be an invasion of that country, and we have seen that many times in the history of nations. It could be sanctions, economic sanctions against the country. It could be political sanctions against the country. It could be total pariah status for that country. And we've seen many, many examples of how countries have been put isolated by the international community. And there's been blockades of shipments to that country so that they are held responsible for that violation of law. That is how you hold countries that are independent responsible. So he says the international law covers a wide array of areas and affairs, and begin to take a look at the areas that international law covers. And essentially, international law covers every aspect of our existence and accounts for every aspect of our existence to make sure that nations are abiding by laws, to make sure that nations are living harmoniously with their neighbors and with others. They're not invading their neighbors. They're not, going to their neighbors' countries and crossing borders and causing havoc. They are abiding by the laws put together by the international community, essentially, and primarily the United Nations. And we have economic laws that are put together by other organizations. For example, the World Trade Organization, or the World Bank, or the IMF, and other institutions that are responsible for regulating the economic aspect of our existence as a global unit. So international law impacts economics, it impacts politics, right? And there are political laws that countries have to obey. There are laws and protocols, right? Protocols are not laws, but they are laws, and then there are also protocols that countries have to pay attention to. When we talk about economics, right, international law impacts economics in terms of how countries can interact with countries economically, how they can deal with countries economically, how the big countries deal with the smaller countries economically. And this is a very important point, because if we don't have international law regulating the interactions, regulating the activities of countries on the global stage, maybe through the World Trade Organization that regulates trade between countries and oversees that aspect of our existence as a global unit, there will be all kinds of inequality in the process. So when we talk about international law, we are talking about international law governing the economic practices of countries. Please take note of this, students. International law governs the economic practices of countries when they trade with others. For example, we have OPEC, Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries. That's what it stands for. So we have OPEC, right? So let's put that here, right? OPEC, as it stands for Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, OPEC. So let's make sure we have that right. Please take note of this. Now, this is an organization of countries that export oil, and we have some notable countries in OPEC. Saudi Arabia, for example, is part of it, and the countries in the Middle East. Nigeria is part of OPEC. Nigeria is the largest oil producer in Africa, and other countries as well, right? So they have their laws. They have their operating laws. And when we talk about the economics and politics, we have laws as well governing the political actions and practices of countries. And those laws are very important, because when countries go against those laws, sometimes there is chaos. Take note of this, students. There is chaos when countries go against those political laws that are put in place by the United Nations, are put in place by other organizations. You know, how countries interact with countries politically, how they make laws, right? The United Nations, with its structure and all of those things, ensures that we have political laws that are international in scope, scale, that regulate policies, that put in place policies, that put in place laws and regulations that countries have to abide by. And we have wars as well, in terms of how countries will conduct themselves in war. The Geneva Convention, for example, how you deal with prisoners, how you deal with war prisoners. You go to war against a country goes to war against its neighbor, for example, and captures soldiers. You don't kill them. You have to take them in and care for them. You have to feed them and protect them until there is some agreement that is reached with the other party. There are laws governing how countries behave when it comes to this. For example, in wars, countries have to respect cultural heritage of the other country. You don't go bombing at museums and historical sites. You leave those alone. Those are not part of your target. When it comes to war, you leave religious establishments and institutions alone. You don't bomb those tents. You leave children out of war and women out of war as well. All of those things are expectations. All of those things are regulations. All of those things are policies and laws that control and regulate the process of war between and among countries. Take note of this. This is a very important point we are making here. Take note of this. This is a very important point. We'll talk about international law. These are laid down laws that countries have to abide by. International law covers border disputes as well in terms of how countries can resolve border disputes. And there are many examples of countries taking perhaps their neighbors, of course, it has to be their neighbors, to the International Court of Justice to adjudicate border disputes. And we have a good example between Nigeria, this is Nigeria, and Cameroon versus Cameroon, where Cameroon took Nigeria to the ICJ, stands for International Court of Justice, based in the Netherlands, and Cameroon was alleging that a strip of land known as the Bakassi Peninsula, this is Peninsula, belongs to them. A portion of it belongs to them, and they took Nigeria to the ICJ, and they won that case, and Nigeria turned over that territory to Cameroon, and as we speak, that territory belongs to Cameroon, and Cameroonian flag is flying over that territory and is being controlled and ruled by Cameroon. That is how international law works, students. You take countries to the ICJ to determine the legitimacy of your claim. And we have many examples. So now, not all countries abide by that. For example, the United States has not abided by International Court of Justice ruling when it came to its case with Nicaragua. But some countries abide by it. And if countries don't abide by it, there are consequences. And we just talked about some of the consequences in terms of economic sanctions, political sanctions. It could be a total isolation. It could be sometimes a military invasion as well, as we've seen time and time again in history. International law governs human rights. International law governs diplomacy as well. Human rights, some of the laid down basic fundamental human rights. For example, rights to life is there in international law, that countries cannot take the life of a citizen without due course. Cannot take the life of a citizen willy-nilly, because you have the power to do so. Right? So human rights, just basic human rights. Right to life, right to education, for example. Right to work, for example, provide for yourself. Right to shelter, for example. And many other rights that are guaranteed under international law. And that's why sometimes when countries violate those rights of their citizens, other countries condemn those countries. Other countries condemn that particular country. They come out and say, this is not right, and we will take action. We will withdraw this loan. We will not give you loans until you rectify and modify that law, until you ensure that your citizens are not oppressed. Many examples we have as to how international law works in this area. And so the power of international law is very, very important because it keeps nations in check. And international law also deals with diplomacy, how countries interact with countries on the global stage, how countries talk with countries on the global stage, how the channels they use to interact and solve problems, economic problems, political problems, and social problems, and cultural problems, and religious problems, and so forth. Unlike national laws, now let's take note of this, right? So we have national laws and we have international laws as well, right? As we were just discussing. So unlike national laws, international laws deal exclusively with nations. Please take note of this, right? So international law only deals with nations. Only deals with nations. It doesn't deal with cities within the country or towns within the country. It deals with nations, sovereign nations in this case. So exclusively deals with nations and have to rely on the cooperation of nations to abide by its ruling. What does that mean? So let's ask this question. It says here, international law relies on the cooperation of nations to abide by its ruling, right? So nations have to abide by its ruling, but sometimes nations escape the consequences of not abiding by its ruling. And those nations are powerful nations. They know that not everyone can come. They know that other countries can come after them because they have economic clout, they have political clout, they have they have far-reaching military might, and they know that they are not subject to international law. Now that is wrong, but that's how it is. It's a power play. It's if you have power on the global scene, if you have the economic power, the political power, and the military power, you can evade international law. Now, that is wrong, but that's the way it is. And that's the structure of power, and that's the stratification of nations on the global scene in terms of your economic and political strength, as well as your military strength. So it relies on the cooperation of nations to abide by the ruling. Now, going by the example of Nigeria versus Cameroon, if Nigeria said, no, we are not giving that piece of land to Cameroon, what would have happened? Nigeria is a very powerful country militarily, and most likely nothing would have happened. And Cameroon going to war against Nigeria is not going to solve that particular situation. So it relies on the cooperation of nations, and nations have to willingly say, yes, we accept the ruling of the International Court, especially if they are signatories, right? And again, this is a very important point, students. Nations sign on to laws, international laws, and say, we have seen this law and we agree with it. We're going to abide by this law. And if they violate that law, then they are subject to the consequences. So they agree with the stipulations, and they agree and sign on to that law. And therefore, their cooperation is needed when they violate that particular law. So it relies on the cooperation of nations to abide by its ruling. And as we said earlier, if nations don't abide by ruling, sometimes there are consequences depending on who you are, right, what that nation is. Powerful nations often evade the consequences, but nations that are not so powerful, economically and politically and militarily, right, are subject to the consequences. They don't abide by those rulings. There could be economic sanctions on them. And we'll see again many examples of how nations have been sanctioned economically. Iran, for example, has been sanctioned several times by the Western countries for violating this and that and so forth. Nuclear, for example, nuclear weapons acquisition sometimes is regulated by the International Body for Nuclear Weapons Safety. And if a country goes against that, they face the sanctions of other countries. And we see many examples, for example, Iran. So international law is difficult to enforce on independent states. As we said, it's difficult to enforce on independent states that are sovereign, because countries are sovereign and they take their sovereignties very seriously. They frown at any suggestion that they are subject to laws. And even though they may have signed on to those laws, when it comes time to enforcement, sometimes there's resistance. So international law is difficult to enforce. Please take note of this. Even though nations sign on to these laws, sometimes it's difficult to enforce, because they see the reality of the law, they see the consequences of the law, and sometimes they say, we are independent, we're not subject to any external laws. And that's where other countries, we hold them accountable. And we'll come back to this point here, right? Holds countries accountable. Although such disregard may garner the international community against the country in the form of global isolation, diplomatic isolation, economic isolation, and even war, right? So countries stand the risk of all of this. Countries that violate international law and don't obey the consequences and don't subject themselves to the consequences sometimes can risk global isolation, diplomatic isolation, economic sanctions, and even war. Again, we've seen many examples. So students, when we talk about the foundations of international law, it's important for us to understand the elements of this law, the elements of this type of law, the formation of this type of law, how it impacts nations around the world, and how nations respond to international law, right? So we talked about what international law is and a different terminology. International law, public international law or law of nations, a body of laws, right? A body of laws that go beyond, that's what transcends means here, students. It goes beyond international borders. So it doesn't have limitations. It covers the spectrum of the geographical definition of nations, right? And holds countries accountable. The body of laws holds countries accountable, right? And then we just talked about international law covering a wide array of areas, and these are the areas we talked about: economics, politics, war, right? The conduction of war, right? Border dispute, human rights, and diplomacy. Now, when we talk about war now, because this is a very important point, students, as we've seen war going on in Ukraine, we've seen war going on in the Middle East, and wars around the world, right? You cannot, for example, when in war, and I give example of how you treat prisoners, right? And there's again the Geneva Convention is there. But for example, in war, if a nation uses, let's say, artilleries against its enemy, well, that enemy cannot respond with nuclear weapons. The response has to be proportional, and that is part of international law. You cannot respond to artillery attack with nuclear weapons as a country, as part of international law, and recognizing that you have to respond in like measure. You have to, respond with artilleries, for example, or maybe something along those lines, but certainly not nuclear weapons. So these laws govern how nations behave in certain situations. So we talked about all of these domains, and then we talked about, unlike national laws, international laws, right, deal exclusively with nations. Please take note of this point. It deals with nations. It doesn't deal with cities within nations or towns within nations. It deals exclusively with nations, and then also relies, that is, again, the body of international laws relies on the cooperation of nations to abide by its ruling. International law is difficult to enforce when we talk about independent states. Again, the key word here is independent and sovereignty. And countries take this very seriously when they are challenged in this area. And again, although countries may disregard, right, international law and so forth, the international community collectively can hold a country accountable. Now, even the most powerful countries can be held accountable. If the community of nations wants to do that, they can hold the most powerful countries accountable. They can put sanctions on that country. They can restrict its citizens from traveling to their countries. They can, block their airspaces, for example, for the airlines owned by that country not to overfly their airspaces. And if every country does that, that country is held accountable in that sense. So this is the foundation of international law. And it's important for us to understand how international law plays out amongst countries and the institutions that regulate, primarily the United Nations, the World Trade Organization, the World Bank, IMF, and the different organizations around the world that ensure that international law is upheld. All right, so we're going to stop here, and we're going to discuss more of international law, specifically the aspect of how it is put together in the United Nations and the processes of engagement and participation of countries.